that we throw away so much food. Think about your refrigerator. It's full of things that will go bad in a week. A little mold on the cheese, if we toss it, brown spots on a banana in the bin. It's estimated that we waste about a third of all the food produced for us. That's over 1 billion tons a year. Well, a billion, it's a number. So big, it's hard to even picture. Now, imagine a world without refrigerators. No freezers, no vacuum sealed packages or chemical preservatives. No grocery store down the street open 24/7. That was the medieval world. For them, wasting food wasn't just a bad habit. It was a death sentence. A spoiled harvest meant starvation. A rotten side of beef meant a hungry winter. Survival depended entirely on one thing making food last. Their solutions weren't high-tech. They were born from desperation and observation. They used the elements around them. Salt from the sea, smoke from the fire, and ice from the winter, even the dirt under their feet. They fought a daily, relentless war against decay, and they got incredibly good at it. Their methods weren't just practical, they were genius. They created flavors and textures we still chase today. Prosciutto, cheese, pickles, smoked salmon, these aren't modern inventions. They are echoes from a time when a full pantry was the only real security you had. How did they do it? What did they know that we've forgotten? Number 15, how did salt become more valuable than gold? Salt wasn't just a seasoning in the medieval world, it was life, it was technology. It was the single most important substance for keeping food edible. Without it, entire communities would have starved over the winter. The power of salt is simple, it's a desiccant, it draws water out of things. This process is called osmosis. Every living thing needs water to survive, including the bacteria and mold that make food rot. When you pack a piece of meat in salt, the salt pulls the water out of the meat cells. But it also pulls the water out of any bacteria on the surface. The bacteria shrivel up and die, or at least become dormant. No water, no rot. It's that basic. The Romans understood this. The very word salary comes from the Latin salarium, which was the payment given to Roman soldiers to buy salt. They built entire roads, like the Via Salaria in Italy, just to transport salt. By the medieval period, this importance had only grown. Salt was a geopolitical tool. Governments controlled its production and taxed it heavily. In France, the infamous salt tax, the gabelle, was established in 1286 and became one of the most hated taxes in history, a major source of revenue for the crown and a major source of misery for the poor. It wasn't fully abolished until 1946. This tax shows you how critical and how controlled salt was. You couldn't just get it anywhere. There were two main ways they used it. The first was dry curing. You'd take a ham or a side of fish and rub it with a thick layer of coarse salt. Sometimes herbs and spices were mixed in, but salt was the workhorse. The meat was then hung in a cool, dry place for weeks or months. The salt pulled out the moisture, and the air circulated around it, drying it even further. This is how we get things like prosciutto and jamon serrano. It's a slow, patient process that transforms the meat, concentrating its flavor and making it shelf-stable for a year or more. A medieval farmer could slaughter a pig in the autumn and still be eating it the following summer, all thanks to a crust of salt. The second method was brining, or wet curing. This meant dissolving a large amount of salt in water to create a super salty solution. Meats, fish, and even vegetables were submerged in this brine. The salt solution would slowly penetrate the food, killing microbes and preserving it from the inside out. This was the method for making corned beef, salt pork, and pickles. Salt pork was the fuel of armies and navies for centuries. It was tough, incredibly salty, and had to be soaked in fresh water for hours before it was even remotely edible. But it didn't spoil. On a long sea voyage, a barrel of salt pork was the difference between a healthy crew and a crew dying of starvation. The Vikings were masters of preserving fish, especially cod, in salt. They would dry it and salt it until it was as hard as a piece of wood. This stockfish, or bacalhau, could last for years and was a major trade commodity for them. The knowledge wasn't just in the application, but in the source. Salt didn't come in a neat blue canister. It had to be harvested. People living near the coast would create salt pans, large shallow pools where they'd let seawater evaporate under the sun, leaving the salt crystals behind. The salt pans of Guerande in France have been in use for over 1,000 years. Inland, they relied on salt mines, like the massive Wieliczka salt mine near Krakow, Poland, which was a functioning mine from the 13th century until 2007. It's a whole underground city, with chapels and statues carved out of the rock salt by the miners. That's how important it was. They built worlds underground just to get it. Mark Kurlansky, in his book Salt of World History, details how this single mineral-shaped civilization started wars and built empires. It was the original white gold. But it wasn't a perfect system. Botulism was a constant threat if the salt concentration wasn't high enough. The food was often so salty it was borderline inedible without extensive soaking, which also leached out nutrients. And a diet that heavy in salt likely had serious health consequences, contributing to a host of problems that they would have had no way of understanding. They weren't trying to make gourmet food, they were just trying to survive. What specific microbial life managed to survive high salinity medieval curing? And did these extremophiles contribute unique flavors that we have now lost in our modern, more sterile processes? How much did the regional mineral content of different salt sources, rock salt versus sea salt from different oceans, affect the final taste and preservative qualities of the food? And if we lost our global supply chain, could we even build the infrastructure to produce and transport enough salt to feed a large population using only medieval technology? Number 14, could you taste the forest in their food? Fire did more than just cook food, it preserved it. Smoking is one of the oldest preservation techniques, likely discovered by accident. Maybe a piece of meat was left hanging in a smoky cave or hut and was found to last longer and taste different. By the medieval period, it was a refined science. Smoking works in a few ways. First, the smoke dehydrates the surface of the food, creating a dry, tough layer called a pellicle. This pellicle is a physical barrier that helps keep bacteria and mold from getting in. But the real magic is in the chemistry of the smoke itself. Burning wood isn't a clean process. It releases hundreds of different chemical compounds into the air. Some of these, like formaldehyde and phenols, are natural antimicrobials and antioxidants. They are literally poison to the things that cause rot. When these compounds settle on and penetrate the food, they act as a preservative shield. The antioxidants also slow down the process of fat going rancid, which is a major problem with fatty fish and meats. So smoking is a triple threat. It dries, it creates a barrier, and it lays down a chemical defense. They didn't have stainless steel electric smokers, they had smokehouses. These could be anything from a small dedicated stone hut to simply the rafters of a family's home. You know, in many medieval longhouses, the fire was in the center of the room with a hole in the roof for some, but not all, of the smoke to escape. The entire living space was filled with a constant haze. This wasn't great for your lungs, but it was fantastic for the hams, sausages, and sides of bacon hanging from the ceiling. They were being slowly, continuously cold smoked, day in and day out. The food was infused with the smell of the home and the wood that kept the family warm. The choice of wood was critical. It wasn't just fuel, it was an ingredient. Different woods produce different kinds of smoke and impart different flavors. Hardwoods like oak, alder, hickory, and apple were preferred. They burn slowly and produce a rich, pleasant-tasting smoke. Softwoods like pine were avoided. They contain a lot of resin, which creates a nasty, acrid smoke that coats the food in a bitter, sooty film. The medieval cook knew this. They knew that alder was perfect for fish, giving it a delicate, sweet flavor. They knew oak gave a strong, robust flavor to hams and bacon. The terroir of their food wasn't just from the soil, it was from the very trees of the local forest. In Scandinavia, they used birch. In North America, indigenous peoples used hickory and mesquite. The food was a direct reflection of its environment. There were two main types of smoking. So hot smoking done at temperatures high enough to cook the food around 140 to 180 deg F, or 60 to 82 deg C, was for food that would be eaten relatively soon. It preserved, but not for the very long term. Cold smoking was the true preservation art. This was done at very low temperatures, below 85 deg F or 30 deg C. The goal was to saturate the food with smoke without actually cooking it. This could take days, even weeks of continuous low-level smoking. The fire would be built away from the food, with the smoke piped into the smokehouse or chamber. This slow, patient process resulted in products like smoked salmon lox, many types of sausage, and country hams that could last for months without refrigeration. Archaeological evidence supports the long history of this practice. The remains of ancient smokehouses have been found across Europe. For example, excavations at the medieval fishing village of Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland, a Norse settlement from around 1000 AD, show evidence of structures likely used for smoking and drying fish to preserve the catch for the long journey back to Greenland. This wasn't just for home use. Smoked herring, known as red herring because of its color after heavy smoking, was a massive trade item. The Hanseatic League, a powerful confederation of merchant guilds in Northern Europe, traded huge quantities of it. It was cheap protein that traveled well, feeding cities and armies. The book Food in Medieval Times by Melita Weiss Adamson highlights how these preserved staples were the backbone of the medieval diet, especially for the lower classes. Of course, it was a risky business. If the temperature got too high during cold smoking, you just end up with partially cooked, unsafe food. If the smoke wasn't dense enough, it wouldn't preserve properly, and the same chemicals that killed bacteria weren't exactly health food. Some of the compounds in wood smoke are carcinogenic. A diet heavy in smoked foods, combined with a life spent in a smoky house, likely contributed to a range of health issues. They traded long-term health risks for short-term survival. It was a trade they had to make. What specific, now extinct wood species were used for smoking in certain regions, and what unique flavor profiles have we lost forever with the disappearance of those forests? How did they precisely control temperature for cold smoking over days or weeks without thermometers, relying only on feel and experience? Were there master smokers whose skills were legendary? And did they pass down their secrets through apprenticeships like other medieval crafts? Number 13, what if the sun was your only refrigerator? Long before there were electric dehydrators, there was the sun and the wind. Drying is the simplest and oldest form of food preservation. It works for the same reason salting does, it removes water. Most microorganisms need a water activity level of 0.91 or higher to grow. By drying food, you can lower that level to somewhere between 0.20 and 0.60, making it an inhospitable desert for bacteria, yeast, and mold. It's a method that requires minimal equipment, just a dry, sunny, and breezy climate. For cultures in warm, arid regions like the Middle East or the Mediterranean, this was the default method. Fruits were a primary target. Grapes were laid out on mats under the hot sun to become raisins. Plums became prunes, figs and dates, naturally high in sugar, dried beautifully and became calorie-dense, portable snacks that would last for months. These dried fruits were a crucial source of sweetness and nutrients during the winter, when fresh fruit was impossible to find. They were so important they even feature in religious texts. The Bible, for instance, mentions cakes of figs and clusters of raisins as provisions for travelers and soldiers. In cooler, wetter climates, like Northern Europe, sun drying was less reliable. Here, they relied more on air drying. They would build simple racks or just hang foods from the rafters of a well-ventilated attic or shed. The constant airflow would slowly wick the moisture away. This was especially common for fish and meat. The iconic image of Viking longships often includes racks of cod hanging to dry in the cold, salty sea air. This created stockfish, a product so dry and hard it was almost indestructible. It had to be pounded with a mallet and soaked for days before it could be cooked, but it provided a vital source of protein that fueled their long voyages of exploration and raiding. Archaeologists have found fish drying racks at sites all over the North Atlantic, dating back to well before the medieval period. Meat was also air-dried. Thin strips of beef, venison, or other game would be salted and then hung to dry. This is the origin of jerky. The word jerky itself comes from the Quechua word harki, meaning dried, salted meat, a practice used by the Incas for centuries. While that's a South American example, the principle was used worldwide. In Europe, they made products like biltong's ancestor, a cured, air-dried meat that was a staple for travelers. Vegetables and herbs were also dried. Peas and beans were left to dry on the vine before being harvested and stored in sacks. Sliced mushrooms, onions, and various greens were threaded onto strings and hung up. Herbs were tied in bundles and hung upside down in a dry place. This preserved their flavor and medicinal properties, allowing a medieval cook to add a hint of summer to a winter stew. The Medieval Household by G.G. Colton describes how the rhythm of the year was dictated by these preservation tasks, with late summer and autumn being a frantic period of harvesting and drying to prepare for the lean months ahead. The process was simple but not foolproof. A sudden rainstorm could ruin a whole harvest of drying fruit. If the air was too humid, mold would grow before the food could dry out. Pests were a constant problem. Birds, rodents, and insects were all drawn to the drying food. People had to constantly watch their precious stores, and the texture of the food was irrevocably changed. It became tough, chewy, and sometimes leathery. Rehydrating, it was an art in itself, but the trade-off was worth it. A dried apple slice might not be as good as a fresh one, but it was far better than no apple at all in the dead of January. Drying concentrated the flavor and the nutrients, creating a lightweight, portable, and long-lasting food source. It was the original MRE meal ready to eat, powered by nothing but the sun and the wind. Could we map the precise atmospheric conditions, humidity, wind speed, solar intensity of specific medieval regions to understand why certain types of drying worked better there than elsewhere? What forgotten varieties of fruits and vegetables were specifically cultivated because their low water content made them ideal for drying, varieties we've since let die out? Beyond simple dehydration, did they understand how UV light from the sun was also sterilizing the surface of the food? And did they have practices to maximize this exposure without causing nutrient degradation? Number 12, did they pickle everything that moved? Vinegar is a magical substance. It's a sour, acidic liquid that can transform food and, more importantly, protect it. Pickling, or preserving food in an acidic medium, was a cornerstone of the medieval pantry. The principle is straightforward. Most bacteria that spoil food cannot survive in a highly acidic environment. A pH level of 4.6 or lower is the magic number. It inhibits the growth of most harmful microbes, including the one that causes botulism, Clostridium botulinum. Vinegar, which is essentially acetic acid, easily creates this environment. So where did they get their vinegar? They made it. Any weak alcoholic beverage, wine, beer, cider, that is left exposed to the air will eventually be colonized by acetobacter, a type of bacteria that consumes the alcohol and converts it into acetic acid. This was a common occurrence. A batch of wine that went wrong wasn't necessarily a disaster, it was the start of a batch of vinegar. They had red wine vinegar, white wine vinegar, cider vinegar, and even ale vinegar, known as Aligar. The quality varied wildly, but its preservative power was constant. The range of things they pickled is staggering. It went far beyond the cucumbers we think of today. Cabbages, onions, carrots, beets, green beans, mushrooms, and even flowers like nasturtium buds were common. Pickled eggs were a tavern staple. Meats and fish were also frequently pickled. Pickled herring was a huge commodity in Northern Europe, alongside the smoked and salted varieties. Guillaume-esque, a dish from the 14th century English cookbook, the form of curry features pickled salmon. It was a way to preserve the catch from a river or the sea. Even walnuts were pickled, harvested green before their shells had hardened. The process was simple. The food would be cleaned and sometimes pre-treated by salting it for a day or two to draw out some of the water. This helped the pickling liquid penetrate better and made the final product crisper. Then it was packed into earthenware jars or wooden barrels. The pickling liquid vinegar, often mixed with salt, sugar, honey, and spices, was boiled and poured over the food. Spices weren't just for flavor. Many of them, like mustard seed, cloves, and peppercorns, have their own antimicrobial properties, adding another layer of preservation. The containers were then sealed as tightly as possible, often with a layer of oil on top or a piece of cloth tied down, and stored in a cool, dark place. Pickling didn't just preserve food, it made some tough or unpalatable foods edible. It could break down tough vegetable fibers and add a bright acidic flavor that could cut through the richness of fatty meats or the monotony of a grain-based diet. In a world where flavors could be bland and repetitive, a sharp, tangy pickle was a welcome jolt to the palate. The 13th century scholar Alexander Neckham wrote about the importance of various sauces and condiments, including vinegar-based ones, to accompany the often simple fare of the time. Pickling was a way to capture the harvest. A farmer could take the autumn glut of cabbages and, through pickling, ensure a source of vegetables throughout the winter, providing crucial vitamins when fresh greens were unavailable. It was also a way to deal with scraps and less desirable cuts. The bits and pieces left over after butchering could be pickled and preserved. Nothing was wasted. This practicality is at the heart of so many medieval food traditions. But like other methods, it had its dangers. If the acid level wasn't high enough, or if the container wasn't clean, nasty things could still grow. The use of lead-glazed pottery for pickling was also a potential source of lead poisoning, as the acid could leach lead from the glaze into the food. But for the most part, it was a reliable and effective way to keep the larder full. It was a technology of transformation, turning perishable goods into long-lasting staples with a simple bath of sour wine. Did different types of wood used for pickling barrels like oak or chestnut impart, specific flavor compounds and tannins that also aided in preservation, similar to how they affect wine and whiskey. We know about botulism, but what other specific microbial battles were being won or lost inside medieval pickling crocks, and did some good bacteria survive to create probiotic effects? How did they test the acidity of their vinegar to ensure it was strong enough to preserve safely, or was it purely trial and error, with deadly mistakes being a part of the learning process? Number 11 was rotting food. Actually a good thing? This sounds counterintuitive. The whole point is to stop food from rotting. But fermentation is a kind of controlled rot. It's the process of using beneficial microorganisms, bacteria, yeasts, and molds to transform food in a way that preserves it and creates new, often intense flavors. Instead of fighting all microbes, you encourage the right ones to take over. These good microbes create an environment, usually by producing acid or alcohol, where the bad spoilage causing microbes can't survive. It's like cultivating a microscopic army to defend your food. Lactic acid fermentation is one of the most common types. This is how you get things like sauerkraut and kimchi. In medieval Europe, cabbage was a staple food. To make sauerkraut, you just need cabbage and salt. The cabbage is shredded, mixed with salt, and packed down tightly into a crock. The salt pulls water out of the cabbage, creating its own brine. The salt also kills off many types of unwanted bacteria, but it creates the perfect environment for lactobacillus bacteria, which are naturally present on the cabbage leaves. These bacteria consume the sugars in the cabbage and produce lactic acid as a byproduct. This acid lowers the pH, pickling the cabbage and protecting it from other forms of decay. The result is a tangy, sour dish, rich in vitamins, especially vitamin C, that could last for months. For sailors and people in northern climates, sauerkraut was a lifesaver, a crucial defense against the vitamin deficiency disease scurvy. Captain Cook famously took barrels of it on his long sea voyages in the 18th century, a practice rooted in much older traditions. Alcoholic fermentation is another one we're all familiar with. This is the work of yeasts, which consume sugar and produce alcohol and carbon dioxide. This is how they made beer, wine, and mead. In the medieval period, these weren't just recreational drinks. They were a vital source of calories and, importantly, a safer alternative to often contaminated water. The brewing process involved boiling the water, which killed pathogens, and the resulting alcohol then acted as a preservative. Beer was a part of the daily diet for everyone, including children, though it was likely weaker than most modern beers. It was a way of preserving the grain harvest, turning perishable barley into a safe, storable, and nutritious liquid. The Domesday Book of 1086, a massive survey of England, lists breweries and pubs, showing how integral they were to the fabric of society. Then there's cheese. Milk is incredibly nutritious, but spoils very quickly. Turning it into cheese is a form of fermentation that can make it last for years. The process starts by adding a starter culture of bacteria to the milk to begin fermentation, followed by rennet and enzyme, traditionally from a calf's stomach, to curdle it. The solid curds are separated from the liquid whey, salted, pressed, and then aged. During aging, a complex ecosystem of bacteria and molds goes to work, breaking down fats and proteins and developing the incredible diversity of flavors and textures we see in cheeses. A hard cheese, like Parmesan, could be aged for years, becoming a hard, dry, and nutrient-dense food that was easy to transport and store. Monasteries were often centers of cheese-making innovation, with monks like those of the Benedictine order perfecting recipes that are still used today. They had the time, the records, and the dedication to turn a practical necessity into an art form. Fermentation was a deep, intuitive science. They didn't know about bacteria or yeast. They talked about spirits or the magic that turned grape juice into wine. They learned through observation and passed the knowledge down. A good brewer would save the dregs from a successful batch to start the next one, unknowingly transferring the yeast culture. A cheesemaker would use the same wooden tools without sterilizing them, ensuring the beneficial bacteria were passed on. This uncleanness was actually key to their success. It's a world away from our modern obsession with sanitation, but it worked. They were harnessing invisible forces of nature to create a safe and stable food supply. What was the full microbial diversity of a medieval sourdough starter or a cheese cave? And have we lost key strains that produced unique flavors due to modern sanitation and monoculture practices? How did they manage the risk of bad fermentations, and what were the signs they looked for to know when a batch had been taken over by pathogenic rather than beneficial microbes? Did the terroir of a location, the specific wild yeasts and bacteria in the air of a particular valley or farmhouse play an even larger role in defining regional foods than the raw ingredients themselves? Number 10. Could fat be the ultimate protector? Fat is a fantastic barrier. It's hydrophobic, meaning it repels water, and since bacteria need water to thrive, a thick layer of fat can create an airtight, watertight seal that protects the food underneath. This is the principle behind potting, or confit. The word confit comes from the French verb confire, which means to preserve. The method is most famously associated with southwestern France and dishes like duck confit, but the technique was used all over Europe with various meats and fats. The process starts by curing the meat, usually with salt, for a day or so. This, as we've seen, draws out some moisture and begins the preservation process. The meat is then rinsed and cooked very slowly at a low temperature while completely submerged in its own rendered fat. For duck or goose, this would be duck or goose fat. For pork, it would be lard. This slow cooking tenderizes the meat, making even tough cuts succulent. Once cooked, the meat and the fat are transferred to a deep earthenware pot or crock. The meat is packed in tightly, and then the liquid fat is poured over it, making sure to cover the meat completely. As the fat cools, it solidifies, forming a thick, white, airtight cap. This seal prevents oxygen and airborne bacteria from reaching the meat. As long as the seal remains unbroken, and the pot is stored in a cool, dark place like a cellar, the meat inside can last for months, even up to a year. When it was time to eat, you would simply dig out a piece of meat, scrape off the fat, and then pan fry it until the skin was crispy. The fat itself wasn't wasted. It was used for cooking, adding incredible flavor to roasted potatoes or sautéed vegetables. This was a perfect way to preserve the fatty birds and animals that were often slaughtered in the autumn. It turned a whole pig or a flock of geese into a ready-to-eat supply of meat that could be dipped into all winter long. The book The Art of Charcuterie by Jane Grigson, while modern, delves into the history of these traditional French preservation methods, showing their deep roots in rural, pre-refrigeration life. It was a peasant's technique, born of the need to use every part of the animal and make it last. A similar principle was used for other things too. Cooked mushrooms could be potted in butter. Potted shrimp, a classic British dish, involves cooking shrimp in spiced butter and then letting it set in a small pot with a layer of clarified butter on top. Potted cheese was also common. It involved mixing cheese with butter, wine, and spices, packing it into a pot, and sealing it with a layer of butter. This not only preserved the cheese, but also made it spreadable and allowed for the mixing of different types of cheese or using up-dry, leftover bits. The key to success was the quality of the seal. Any air pockets could lead to spoilage. The fat had to be clean and rendered properly to remove any impurities or water that could cause rancidity. And the storage conditions had to be right. A cellar that was too warm could cause the fat to soften and the seal to fail. But when done correctly, it was a remarkably effective and delicious method of preservation. And it didn't just preserve the food, it transformed it, creating a rich, tender texture and deep flavor that couldn't be achieved any other way. It's a testament to the ingenuity of finding a use for everything, turning a byproduct like animal fat into the very thing that protected the precious meat. How precisely did they render and clarify fat to ensure it was pure enough to create a long-lasting, stable seal without any modern filtering equipment? Were certain animal fats, beyond the obvious lard or duck fat, prized for their unique preservative qualities or flavor infusion, perhaps from game animals or specific breeds of livestock? Did the practice of repeatedly breaking the seal to remove a piece of meat and then resealing it with melted fat introduce specific types of contamination, and what visual or smell-based cues did they use to judge if the contents were still safe? Number 9. Why did they hide their food in the ground? The earth itself can be a pantry. Below the surface, the temperature is much more stable than the air temperature. It's cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter, and it's dark and often damp. This environment is perfect for storing certain kinds of food, especially root vegetables. This is the principle behind the root cellar, a technology that was essential to medieval life. A root cellar could be a custom dug chamber, a section of a natural cave, or just the unheated basement of a house. After the autumn harvest, it would be filled with the hardiest vegetables. Carrots, turnips, parsnips, and beets were packed in boxes or barrels filled with damp sand or sawdust. The sand provided insulation, kept the vegetables from touching each other, which would spread rot, and maintained a high humidity, which prevented them from shriveling and drying out. The potatoes, though, a New World crop and not present in medieval Europe, would later be stored in the same way. Cabbages were often hung upside down from the ceiling. Apples and pears were laid out carefully on shelves, not touching. The goal was not to stop the life processes of the vegetables, but to slow them down dramatically. In the cool, dark, humid environment, these vegetables would remain in a state of dormancy, staying fresh and edible for months. A well-stocked root cellar meant the difference between a winter diet of just bread and salted meat, and one that included vegetables rich in vitamins and minerals. It was a way of extending the harvest long after the fields were frozen. Agricultural treatises from the period, like Walter of Henley's Husbandry from the 13th century, give detailed instructions on managing the estate, including the crucial task of storing the harvest to last until the next one. For those without a cellar, a simpler version was the clamp or storage pit. This was essentially a man-made hole in the ground. You would dig a shallow pit in a well-drained spot, line it with straw for insulation, and then pile in your root vegetables. The pile would be covered with more straw and then a thick layer of earth. A small tuft of straw was often left sticking out of the top to provide a bit of ventilation to prevent the vegetables from sweating and rotting. This created a small, insulated underground mound that protected the vegetables from frost. When you needed some food, you would carefully open one end of the clamp, take what you needed, and seal it back up. It was a simple, low-tech, but highly effective solution. Burying wasn't just for vegetables. Other foods were stored underground too. Eggs could be packed in sand or salt in a cool pit to last longer. Barrels of wine, beer, and pickled goods were kept in cellars where the stable, cool temperature was ideal for long-term storage and aging. The practice of burying food goes back even further. For example, the bog butter, found in Ireland and Scotland, is a fascinating case. Large lumps of butter or other animal fat have been found buried in peat bogs, some of them thousands of years old. The cool, low oxygen, and highly acidic environment of the bog preserved them incredibly well, though it also gave them a very strong, acquired taste. Scholars debate whether this was for long-term storage or for ritual purposes, but it shows a long history of people using the earth as a preservative. This method relied on a deep understanding of the local environment. You had to know where the water table was, which soil drained well, and how deep the frost penetrated in winter. A mistake could lead to a flooded cellar or a clamp full of frozen, ruined vegetables. It was a direct connection between the people and the land they lived on. They weren't just farming on top of the soil, they were using its very substance as a tool for survival. Did burying certain vegetables in specific types of soil clay versus loam versus sandium impart trace minerals or affect their flavor over months of storage? What kinds of fungi and bacteria thrive in root cellar environments, and were some of these actually beneficial, perhaps forming a symbiotic skin on the vegetables that protected them from more harmful decay? How did they combat the constant threat of rodents and other burrowing animals who would have seen a root cellar or a storage clamp as a personal buffet? Number 8 was honey, the medieval secret to eternal fruit. Sugar is a powerful preservative. Like salt, it's a desiccant that draws water out of food and microbial cells through osmosis. A high sugar environment is just as inhospitable to bacteria as a high salt one. In the medieval period, refined cane sugar was an incredibly expensive luxury import, available only to the very wealthy. For most people, the primary source of intense sweetness was honey. And honey wasn't just a sweetener, it was a preservative with almost mystical properties. To have honey is a remarkable substance. It's naturally acidic and has a very low water content. But it also contains small amounts of an enzyme called glucose oxidase, which bees add. When honey is diluted slightly, this enzyme produces hydrogen peroxide, a substance that kills bacteria. This is why raw unpasteurized honey is so resistant to spoilage and has been used for centuries as a wound dressing. It's a natural antimicrobial powerhouse. Archaeologists have found pots of honey in ancient Egyptian tombs that are thousands of years old and still perfectly edible. Medieval people used honey to preserve fruits. Small or soft fruits like berries or larger fruits like quinces and pears cut into pieces would be gently cooked in honey until they were tender. They were then packed into jars and covered completely with the honey syrup. This method, sometimes called sugaring, created a product similar to modern preserves or candied fruit. The fruit would be protected from decay by the high sugar concentration of the honey. It was a way to capture the fleeting sweetness of summer fruits and enjoy them in the middle of winter. And quince, in particular, was often preserved this way, sometimes made into a thick, sliceable paste called a membrillo or cotignac, which was a popular sweetmeat. This wasn't an everyday food for the poor. Honey, while more accessible than sugar, still required beekeeping and was a valuable commodity. A hive was a precious resource, but for a moderately well-off household, preserving some of the orchard's bounty in honey was a standard part of the autumn routine. There's cookbooks from the late medieval period, such as La Viandière by Taillevent, the master cook to French kings, include recipes for fruit preserves and confections that rely on honey. These were often served at the end of a feast, a sweet and impressive treat that showcased the wealth and well-stocked larder of the host. Besides whole fruits, honey was used to make other long-lasting goods. It was the key ingredient in mead, or honey wine, which we've already touched on as a form of fermentation. It was also used in baking. Gingerbread and other honey-sweetened cakes had a long shelf life because the honey inhibited the growth of mold. These dense, spiced cakes were a perfect traveler's food, providing energy and flavor that lasted. The use of expensive imported cane sugar grew towards the end of the medieval period, especially among the nobility in Italy and Spain who had access to Mediterranean trade routes. Sugar was used to create elaborate sculptures and incredibly sweet preserves, a clear display of status. But for most of the era, and for most people, honey was the go-to preservative sweetener. It was a direct product of the local landscape, a golden syrup that not only brought joy to the palate, but also held the power to defy the seasons and keep fruit safe from decay. Did the type of pollen and nectar collected by the bees, for example, from clover versus heather versus chestnut tree Z, result in honeys with measurably different antimicrobial properties and preservative effectiveness? How did they render beeswax to create airtight seals for their honey pots? And was this seal as effective as the fat seal used in confit? We know honey preserves, but what subtle chemical changes occur in fruit stored in honey for years? And do these changes create unique flavor compounds that are impossible to replicate with modern, rapid preservation methods? Number 7. How did they make ice last until summer? Freezing is the ultimate preservation method. It doesn't kill most microbes, but it brings their activity to a screeching halt. When water freezes into ice crystals, it becomes unavailable for the cellular functions of bacteria and mold. Their metabolic processes stop, and they enter a state of suspended animation. The problem for medieval people wasn't understanding that cold preserves food, it was getting access to cold, especially outside of winter. Their solution was the ice house. An ice house was a form of passive refrigeration. It was essentially a deep, insulated pantry designed to keep winter's cold locked in for as long as possible. The concept was ancient, used by Romans and even earlier civilizations, but it was refined and widely used by the wealthy in the medieval and post-medieval periods. An ice house was typically a brick or stone-lined pit or a partially underground building, often with a domed roof. It was usually built on a north-facing slope, shaded by trees, to protect it from the sun. In the dead of winter, workers would be sent to harvest ice from frozen lakes and rivers. They used saws to cut the ice into large, uniform blocks. These blocks were then hauled back to the ice house by horse-drawn sleds. Inside the pit, the blocks were packed tightly together. Sawdust, straw, or peat was used as insulation, packed between the ice blocks and in a thick layer around the entire mass of ice. A drain at the bottom of the pit allowed any meltwater to escape, which was crucial. If the ice sat in water, it would melt much faster. Once full, the ice house was sealed up. The combination of being underground, heavily insulated, and packed with a huge thermal mass of ice meant that it could stay incredibly cold for a very long time. A well-designed ice house could keep its ice frozen through the spring, into the summer, and sometimes even into the next autumn. This was a massive luxury. It allowed a wealthy household to do things that were simply impossible for anyone else. Chilled drinks and sorbets, an incredible status symbol, make ice creams, and, most importantly, from a preservation standpoint, keep perishable foods like fresh meat, fish, and dairy fresh for days or even weeks instead of hours. The book Harvest of the Cold Months, The Social History of Ice and Ices by Elizabeth David details this fascinating story. And ice houses were not for the common person. They required a huge amount of labor to build and to fill each winter. They were the exclusive domain of castles, manor houses, and monasteries. For the average person, refrigeration meant a cold stream, a deep well, or a stone slab in the coolest part of the cellar. In mountainous regions or far northern climates, people could use natural ice caves or pack snow into pits to achieve a similar, if less reliable, effect. This technology highlights the vast gap between the rich and the poor in the medieval world. While a peasant was relying on a piece of heavily salted pork to get through the summer, a lord might be enjoying a chilled pudding made with fresh cream, all thanks to a carefully engineered pit full of frozen river water. It was a way of conquering the seasons, but only for those who could afford the price of entry. For everyone else, the rhythm of a hot summer day was dictated by the urgent need to cook and eat any fresh meat before it spoiled within hours. How did they calculate the optimal ratio of ice to insulation straw or sawdust to maximize the longevity of the ice pack without modern thermodynamic models? Were there specific techniques for welding ice blocks together using a slush of snow and water to create a single, more stable thermal mass? Beyond food preservation, did the presence of an ice house on an estate lead to medical innovations such as using ice to reduce fevers or swelling, long before such practices were medically codified? Number 6, would you eat fish soaked in poison? Some preservation methods sound truly bizarre, even dangerous to modern ears. Curing with lye is one of them. Lye, or sodium hydroxide, is a powerful alkaline chemical. It's caustic, it's used in drain cleaners, and to make soap. It's not something you'd typically associate with food. But in some parts of the world, particularly Scandinavia, it became the key ingredient in a unique and famously challenging dish lutefisk. A lutefisk is made from dried stockfish, usually cod, the same rock-hard, air-dried fish the Vikings carried. To make it edible, the stockfish first has to be rehydrated by soaking it in cold water for several days, with the water changed daily. Then comes the lye. The rehydrated fish is soaked in a dilute solution of lye and water for another couple of days. This is where the chemical magic happens. The lye is a strong base, and it causes the pH of the fish to skyrocket. This extreme alkalinity breaks down the proteins in the fish in a process called saponification, which is essentially the beginning of the soap-making process. The fish swells up, becomes gelatinous, and loses a significant amount of its protein content. Of course, you can't eat fish that's saturated with a caustic chemical. So the final step is another long soak in plain cold water, again changed daily, for 4 to 6 days. This process leaches out the lye, lowering the pH of the fish back to a safe level. What's left is a translucent, jiggly, and famously odorous piece of fish. It's then cooked, usually by steaming or baking, and served, often with butter, salt, and pepper. Why would anyone do this? The lye treatment dramatically changes the texture of the tough, leathery stockfish, making it tender and gelatinous in a way that simple rehydration never could. It's a form of chemical cooking or denaturing. Historically, lye was easy to produce. It was made by leaching water through hardwood ashes, a common byproduct of any household fire. The resulting liquid, potassium hydroxide potash, is also a strong alkali. This made the technique accessible even if chemical manufacturing was centuries away. While lutefisk is the most famous example, lye was used in other food preparations as well, such as in the curing of some types of olives to remove their bitterness, and in making pretzels to give them their characteristic dark brown, shiny crust. The historical food researcher and author of Eat My Words, Janet Clarkson, has explored these more unusual preservation and preparation techniques that fall outside the mainstream. This is clearly a preservation method on the extreme end of the spectrum. The process is long, complicated, and requires careful attention to detail. If the lye isn't properly leached out, the resulting dish could be dangerous. The strong smell and unusual texture have made lutefisk the subject of many jokes and a dish that people either love or despise. But it's a powerful example of human ingenuity. It shows a willingness to experiment with powerful, even dangerous, substances found in the natural environment to transform a staple food into something entirely new. It's taking a food that is already preserved stockfish and reprocessing it to make it palatable after months or years in storage. What is the precise chemical mechanism by which lye breaks down the fish proteins, and does this process unlock any micronutrients that were previously unavailable in the dried fish? Were there regional variations in the type of wood ash used to make lye, and did this result in different flavors or potencies, for instance, oak ash versus birch ash? How many accidental poisonings or chemical burns occurred during the development of this technique before they perfected the dilution and leaching times, a grim history of trial and error that is lost to us. Number 5, could sour grapes save a meal? Before lemons were widely available in Northern Europe, and when vinegar was sometimes too harsh, there was another source of acidic liquid for cooking and preserving verjuice. The name comes from the French juice, or green juice. It's the highly acidic, unfermented juice pressed from unripe grapes. In late spring or early summer, vineyard owners would thin their vines, removing some of the young green grape clusters to allow the remaining grapes to grow larger and sweeter. These sour, unripe grapes would have otherwise been discarded, but instead they were pressed to create verjuice. This was a seasonal but valuable byproduct. Its sharp, tart flavor was less pungent than vinegar, with a more fruity, delicate quality. In cooking, it was used to deglaze pans, to make sauces, and to add brightness to rich, heavy dishes. Medieval cuisine, especially for the wealthy, was often a riot of complex, spiced, and sometimes contradictory flavors. Sweet and sour was a very popular combination, and verjuice was a key player in creating that sour note. Many recipes in the form of curry and other medieval manuscripts call specifically for verjuice. But it also had a role in preservation. Like vinegar, its acidity could inhibit bacterial growth. It was sometimes used as the liquid for light pickling, especially for fish or more delicate vegetables where a strong vinegar flavor would be overwhelming. It was also used as a way to keep other ingredients fresh for a short period. For example, a piece of fish or meat might be wiped down with verjuice to retard spoilage for a day or two before cooking. It wasn't a long-term preservative like salting or smoking, but it was a tool for short-term freshness management in a world without refrigeration. It was the kitchen equivalent of hitting the pause button on decay. The production of verjuice was tied to the geography of winemaking. It was common in France, Spain, and other grape-growing regions. In places where grapes didn't grow, like England, they made a similar product from crab apples or other unripe fruit. This shows the principle was widely understood, harness the acidity of unripe fruit. The medieval scholar Bartholomeus Anglicus, in his 13th century encyclopedia De Proprietibus Reum, on the properties of things, discusses the properties of grapes at different stages of ripeness, showing an understanding of these agricultural cycles and byproducts. Verjuice fell out of fashion as lemons and limes became more common and cheaper through expanded trade routes in the 17th and 18th centuries. But it represents a key aspect of the medieval food mindset: nothing is wasted. A byproduct of viticulture, the thinned out sour grapes that were not good for wine were turned into a valuable commodity for the kitchen. It was an intelligent and efficient use of the entire agricultural process, turning a potential waste product into a tool for both flavoring and preservation. Did the verjuice made from different grape varietals like Pinot Noir versus Chardonnay precursors have distinct flavor profiles and levels of acidity that were preferred for different culinary or preservative applications? What was the typical shelf life of verjuice itself, and how was it preserved through the year after its seasonal production, perhaps by sealing it in casks like wine? Were there other green juices made from other unripe plants or fruits that served a similar purpose in regions without grapes or apples? And have we completely lost the knowledge of these hyper-local techniques? Number 4, was a chicken coop the first pantry? The simplest way to ensure you have fresh meat is to not kill the animal. Keeping livestock alive until the moment you need to eat it is the most effective short-term preservation strategy of all. It's a walking, breathing larder. This might seem obvious, but it was a fundamental part of the medieval food system that we, with our cellophane-wrapped cuts of meat, have completely disconnected from. Most peasant families, even those with very little land, would have kept a few chickens or a goose. These animals were low maintenance. They could forage for much of their own food, eating scraps, insects, and weeds. They provided a regular supply of fresh eggs, a crucial source of protein, and when a chicken was needed for the pot, it could be caught, killed, and cooked within the hour. There was no need for salting or smoking if you were going to eat it right away. The meat was perfectly fresh. A pig was a more significant investment, but also a common sight. A single pig could be raised over season, often set loose in the woods to forage for acorns and roots, a practice known as pannage. In the autumn, it would be slaughtered. This was a major event for the family and often the community. As we've seen, every part of the pig would then be preserved in some way. The ham salted, the bacon smoked, the offal made into sausages, the fat rendered into lard. But the initial act was to raise the live animal, a long-term investment in future preserved food. For the wealthy, this principle was scaled up dramatically. Castles and manors had their own dovecotes, which were large structures built to house pigeons and doves. These birds bred quickly and provided a constant supply of fresh meat, especially in the winter when other game was scarce. They also had fish ponds or stews. These were carefully managed ponds stocked with fish like carp and pike. When the cook needed a fish for the Friday meal when eating meat was forbidden by the church, a servant would simply go out to the pond and net one. The fish was alive right up until it was brought to the kitchen. This was the ultimate luxury fresh fish on demand miles from the sea. Archaeological remains of these elaborate pond systems can still be seen at many medieval sites. The book The Medieval Fish Pond by C.M. Woolgar explores the complex construction and management of these important features of the manorial landscape. This practice even extended to travel. Drovers would herd cattle, sheep, and pigs for long distances to supply markets and armies. The army didn't carry refrigerated trucks full of beef, it brought a herd of live cattle with it on the march. This ensured a supply of fresh meat for the soldiers. It was inefficient in some ways, but the animals had to be fed and watered along the way, but it was the only practical solution. Keeping food alive until you need it is the perfect preservation method. There is zero spoilage. The food is at peak freshness and nutritional value. The main drawback, of course, is that you have to feed and care for the living food source. It requires space, resources, and constant attention, but in a world without any other way to guarantee fresh meat, a chicken in the yard or a fish in the pond was the best food security you could have. Did they practice selective breeding in their chickens or carp specifically for traits that made them easier to keep in small, confined spaces, such as docility or efficient feed conversion? How did they manage the spread of disease in their dovecotes or fish ponds, which were often densely populated and would have been vulnerable to epidemics that could wipe out the entire food source? For drovers moving herds for armies, what was the calculus for how many extra animals to bring to account for losses from predators, disease, and exhaustion along the march? Number 3, how did they turn spoiled milk into treasure? Milk is a perfect food. It's rich in protein, fat, sugar, and vitamins, but it's also a perfect medium for bacterial growth. Left to its own devices at room temperature, fresh, unpasteurized milk will spoil in a matter of hours. For a medieval farmer with a cow, goat, or ewe that produced milk daily, this was a major problem. You could only drink so much fresh milk before the rest of it went sour. The solution was to transform it into products that would last: butter and cheese. Let's start with butter. If you let fresh milk sit, the cream, which is rich in fat, will rise to the top. This cream could be skimmed off and churned. Churning is just vigorous agitation. It forces the fat globules in the cream to clump together, separating from the liquid, which is called buttermilk. These clumps of fat are butter. To preserve it, the butter was washed to remove any remaining buttermilk, which would spoil quickly, and then heavily salted. The salt acted as a preservative, drawing out more moisture and inhibiting bacterial growth. The salted butter, packed tightly into a wooden firkin or an earthenware crock, could last for months, providing a vital source of fat and calories through the winter. Cheese is an even more profound transformation. Cheese making is a form of fermentation that concentrates the solids in milk and removes most of the water, creating a stable, long-lasting food. The first step is to curdle the milk, usually by adding rennet, an enzyme complex found in the stomachs of young ruminant animals. This causes the milk protein casein to tangle together and form solid curds, separating from the liquid whey. The curds are then cut, stirred, and sometimes heated to expel more whey. Next, the curds are drained and salt is added. Salt is crucial. It halts the acid-producing bacteria, helps draw out the remaining whey, controls the growth of unwanted microbes during aging, and adds flavor. The salted curds are then pressed into molds to form a solid wheel of cheese. The final step is aging, or ripening. The cheese is moved to a cool, damp cellar or cave and left for weeks, months, or even years. During this time, a complex community of bacteria, yeasts, and molds goes to work, breaking down the fats and proteins into a huge array of aromatic and flavorful compounds. This is what creates the difference between a young mild cheese and an old, sharp, complex one. Hard, aged cheeses like cheddar or Parmesan were particularly valuable as preservation tools. They had a very low moisture content and a high salt content, making them extremely stable. A large wheel of cheese was like a savings account of protein and fat. It could be stored for long periods and was dense and portable, making it good food for travelers or soldiers. The monasteries were major centers of cheesemaking. With their large herds, dedicated cellars, and literate monks who could keep detailed records, they were able to experiment in perfect cheesemaking techniques. Many famous European cheeses trace their origins back to medieval monasteries. For example, records of Gorgonzola cheese go back to 879 AD. This wasn't just about preservation. It was about creating value. It took a large amount of perishable milk and concentrated it into a smaller, more durable, and more valuable product. Cheese was a major trade good and a vital part of the medieval economy and diet. It was a way of capturing the fleeting bounty of summer pastures and turning it into a solid, savory treasure. Without lab cultures, how did cheesemakers reliably cultivate and maintain the specific strains of bacteria and mold needed for a particular type of cheese, like the blue mold for Roquefort? What was the role of the wooden tools, barrels, and shelves, which we would now consider unhygienic, in inoculating new batches of cheese with the house style of microbes from a particular dairy? How did they determine the exact endpoint for aging a cheese without being able to run chemical analyses, relying solely on smell, touch, and, perhaps a small core sample? Number two, could you survive on bread made of flour and water? Grain was the staff of life in the medieval world, but grain, once ground into flour, doesn't last forever. It can go rancid or get infested with weevils. The most basic way to preserve flour was to bake it into a rock-hard, bone-dry bread, completely devoid of moisture. This was the infamous hardtack. Hardtack, also known as a sea biscuit or ship's biscuit, is about as simple as food gets. It's made from flour, water, and maybe a little salt. That's it. No yeast, no leavening, no fat, no sugar. The dough is mixed, rolled out thick, and baked at a low temperature for a very long time to draw out every last bit of moisture. The result is a dense, heavy cracker that is, as the name implies, incredibly hard. It was a food of pure utility. Its primary virtue was its shelf life. Because it had virtually no water content, it was almost immune to mold. If kept dry, it could last for years. This made it the perfect food for soldiers on campaign and sailors on long voyages. Armies and navies would commission huge quantities of it. An inventory from the reign of King John of England in the early 13th century lists vast stores of ship's biscuits, showing its importance to naval power. The Roman army had a similar product called bucellatum. This wasn't a new idea, but it was perfected in the age of sail and long military campaigns. Eating hardtack was another matter. It was often so hard that you risked breaking a tooth if you tried to bite it directly. The standard way to eat it was to soak it in whatever liquid was available: coffee, beer, soup, or even just water until it softened enough to be chewed. It was bland and tasteless, but it provided the basic carbohydrate calories needed to keep a person going. Sailors and soldiers often complained about their biscuit. It was monotonous, and if it wasn't kept perfectly dry, it could get infested. Weevils were a common problem. The saying, "the lesser of two weevils," is thought to originate from sailors having to choose the less infested biscuit. They would often tap the biscuit on the table before eating it to knock the insects out. But despite these drawbacks, it was a reliable source of calories that wouldn't spoil. It was the fuel that ran the engines of exploration and warfare for centuries. On land, a similar product was the wastel bread, or other forms of twice-baked breads. Biscotti, meaning twice cooked, is a descendant of this idea. These were baked, sliced, and then baked again to dry them out completely. They were a common provision for pilgrims, merchants, and anyone undertaking a long journey. This method shows a focus on a single principle: remove all the water. It sacrifices all pretense of flavor, texture, and culinary enjoyment for the sake of longevity. In a world where your next meal was uncertain, a sack of hard biscuits that you knew would be edible, if not enjoyable, in 6 months was a form of security that is hard for us to appreciate. It was the ultimate survival food, stripped down to its bare essentials. How did bakers achieve a perfectly uniform, low moisture content throughout a thick biscuit without modern, temperature-controlled ovens, and were soft spots, a known cause of premature spoilage for entire batches? Did the type of flour used, wheat versus rye versus barley, significantly affect the hardness and longevity of the hardtack? Beyond weevils, what other specific molds or pests specialized in attacking these dry, starchy provisions, and what methods did they use to try and protect their stores in damp ship holds? Number 1. What if your jar was a pig's bladder? Today we have glass jars with screw-top lids, plastic containers, and vacuum sealers. Creating an airtight seal is easy. In the medieval world, it was a major challenge, but they had ingenious, if sometimes gruesome, solutions. The goal was to protect preserved foods from the air, which carries moisture, mold spores, and bacteria. We've already seen how a layer of fat or honey could create a seal. but they also used physical barriers made from animal parts. Animal bladders, particularly from pigs, were a common tool. After an animal was butchered, the bladder would be carefully removed, emptied, cleaned, and then either salted and dried or simply used while pliable. It had unique properties. When wet, it's stretchy and can be stretched over the top of a pot or crock. As it dries, it shrinks and tightens, creating an incredibly effective drum-tight, airtight seal. People would pack a crock with preserves, potted meat, or salted butter, and then tie a moistened pig's bladder over the top. Once dry, it was a tough protective covering. This was the medieval equivalent of a canning lid. Intestines were used as casings for sausages, grinding up leftover meat scraps, mixing them with salt, spices, and fat, and then stuffing them into a cleaned intestine was a brilliant way to preserve meat. The sausage could then be air-dried, smoked, or fermented. The casing protected the meat inside, allowing it to cure safely while being permeable enough to let moisture escape during the drying process. Sausage making is an ancient art mentioned in texts like Homer's Odyssey, and it was a highly developed craft in medieval Europe, with different regions developing their own signature recipes and techniques. Parchment, which is made from animal skin, could also be used. A piece of parchment, sometimes soaked in oil or coated with wax to make it less porous, could be tied over a jar. Beeswax itself was a valuable sealant. It could be used to coat the outside of containers or to create a sealing layer on top of liquids like wine or verjuice to prevent them from turning to vinegar. Even something as simple as a thick paste of flour and water was used. This could be plastered around the lid of a pot or casserole dish before baking. It would harden in the oven, creating a temporary seal that trapped moisture and steam inside, a technique known as luting that is still used in some forms of traditional cooking. These methods show an incredible resourcefulness. They used every part of the animal. Nothing was wasted. A pig provided meat to be salted, fat for confit, a bladder for sealing jars, and intestines for making sausage. It was a complete self-contained preservation system. This mindset is at the core of medieval survival. The world was a collection of resources, and the challenge was to find a use for everything. A bladder wasn't waste, it was a tool. This intimate, hands-on knowledge of the natural materials around them is something we have almost completely lost. They didn't have plastic wrap, but they had something that worked just as well, sourced from their own backyard. Did the use of an animal bladder as a seal impart any subtle flavors or enzymes into the food it was sealing as it cured over time? How did they ensure the bladders and intestines were cleaned thoroughly enough to prevent them from being a source of contamination for the very food they were meant to protect? Were there artisans who specialized in the production of these natural containers? And was there a trade in high-quality prepared bladders and casings for less skilled households?